Hello and welcome to Guidance Review. I'm David Pudwill, and today we're going to be talking about FDA's recent guidance document, which is titled Recognition and Withdrawal of Voluntary Consensus Standards. So, a few key takeaway points for today's guidance review are: 1, understand FDA's recognition of standards basics, and that's going to be around requests, the extent of recognition, and non-recognition. 2, essential information provided, the scope, and FDA decision-making rationale. And 3, conditions for withdrawal of recognition. So this could be a new version, or that the standard is no longer appropriate for meeting the requirements. So let's go ahead and get into the video. Here we have the guidance document up, or actually the landing page, I should say. And if we scroll down, we see we can download the final guidance document, and we can read the Federal Register notice. And we see here that this particular guidance document is in final. Also, we can check out the docket. So if we go to the Federal Register notice, we can see some details here, and we can see the date that the notice was published, notice of availability, and some background information and general information. We can go to the docket here, or we can submit comments online. That'll take us over to regulations.gov. And we can see here at the top, there's a note, just for your awareness. Regulations.gov will start redirecting users to the beta at https://beta.regulations.gov on Tuesdays and Thursdays for 24 hours, starting at 8 a.m. Eastern Time. So just for your awareness, you might be seeing the beta of this site if you're taking a look at it on Tuesdays and Thursdays. We can see that at the time of this recording, there are 5 comments received. And we can also see that there are a couple other documents that we can open up here, and we can see the date that they were posted as well. If we go ahead and in this landing page again, we go ahead to download the final guidance document, which I've done. We'll pull that actual guidance document up here, and then we can go through it. And this is a relatively brief guidance document. Here, FDA writes that this document was issued on September 15th, 2020, and the draft of this document was issued on September 14th, 2018. And this document supersedes CDRH standard operating procedures for the identification and evaluation of candidate consensus standards for recognition issued on September 17th, 2007. For questions, you can email CDRH at this email address, and you can also contact CBER. And this particular guidance document, what we see, is for the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, as well as for the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research. And if we scroll down, we see here that we can submit public comment at regulations.gov. We can request additional copies from CDRH or CBER. And then in the table of contents here, again, this is what I outlined just at the beginning of this video in terms of, at a high level, the basics of FDA recognition of standards on recognition, requesting recognition, extent of recognition, non-recognition, notification of determination, some supplemental information, and some information on withdrawal of recognition. And that'll wrap up today's video once we get through that. So we'll move into the meat of the document. And here we see an introduction, and FDA writes that this particular guidance outlines principles for recognizing a standard wholly, partly, or not at all, as well as reasons and rationales for withdrawing a standard. For the current edition of the FDA recognized consensus standards referenced in this document, they link us to the FDA recognized consensus standards database, and that's a useful link to have on hand. FDA's guidance documents, including this guidance, do not establish legally enforceable responsibilities. And this, again, is some of this boilerplate language on this being FDA's current thinking on a topic and should be viewed as recommendations. And the use of the word should means that something is suggested or recommended, but not required. And then a little bit of background here that Congress enacted the Food and Drug Administration Modernization Act of 1997, or FDAMA, and the 21st Century Cures Act. These acts amended the FD&C Act by amending Section 514C, 21 U.S.C. 360D, Subpart C, regarding the recognition of standards. The term recognize in Section 514C refers to FDA's identification of standards as appropriate for manufacturers of products to declare conformance to meet relevant requirements under the FD&C Act, including pre-market submission requirements. This guidance refers to voluntary consensus standards recognized by FDA, and CDRH's Standards and Conformity Assessment Program furthers the aim of international harmonization because the same standards or international equivalents are relied upon by sponsors to meet other countries' regulatory requirements when appropriate. And here they specifically call out the GSPR and the EU MDR. And then if we look at scope, this guidance describes the procedures that FDA follows and the actions FDA may take during its review and evaluation of requests for standards recognition or the withdrawal of recognition, and provides further clarity and explanation about the regulatory framework, policies, and practices regarding FDA's recognition and withdrawal of recognition of voluntary consensus standards. And here, under the FDA recognition of standards, FDA writes that the agency recognizes voluntary consensus standards to help facilitate meeting requirements under the statute or regulations. The use of FDA-recognized consensus standards can increase predictability, streamline pre-market review, provide clearer regulatory expectations, facilitate market entry for safe and effective medical products, and promote international harmonization. FDA considers for recognition voluntary consensus standards, that is, standards that are developed by voluntary consensus standards bodies. And these bodies are defined as any organization that plans, develops, establishes, or coordinates standards using a voluntary consensus standards development process that includes the attributes or elements outlined in the OMB Circular A 119, Federal Participation in the Development and Use of Voluntary Consensus Standards, and in conformity assessment activities. FDA believes these attributes or elements help ensure that standards recognized by FDA are fair and relevant and useful for regulatory purposes. This in turn encourages their use by manufacturers and advances opportunities for national and international harmonization. Specifically, these attributes or elements are: 1. Openness. The procedures or processes used are open to interested parties. Such parties are provided meaningful opportunities to participate in standards development on a non-discriminatory basis. The procedures or processes for participating in standards development and for developing the standard are transparent. 2. Balance. The standards development process should be balanced. Specifically, there should be meaningful involvement from a broad range of parties with no single interest dominating the decision-making. 3rd, due process. Due process shall include documented and publicly available policies and procedures, adequate notice of meetings and standards development, sufficient time to review drafts and prepare views and objections, access to views and objections of other participants, and a fair and impartial process for resolving conflicting views. 4, an appeals process. An appeals process shall be available for the impartial handling of procedural appeals. 5, consensus. Consensus is defined as general agreement, but not necessarily unanimity. During the development of consensus, comments and objections are considered using fair, impartial, open, and transparent processes. These elements apply to activities related to the development of voluntary consensus standards, nationally or internationally. For example, the International Electrotechnical Commission, IEC, the International Organization for Standards, or ISO, the International Electrical and Electronics Engineers, IEEE, I should say, and ASTM International usually develop standards and meet these criteria, as do standards developed in adherence with the American National Standards Institute, or ANSI, essential requirements. FDA may also recognize standards developed in the private sector, for example, by professional societies, industrial associations, and or other organizations such as the United States Pharmacopoeia Convention, that's USP, that meet the criteria discussed in OMB Circular A119. FDA prioritizes international and U.S. voluntary consensus standards for recognition. However, FDA may consider national standards of other countries when no international or U.S. national equivalent standard is available. Note that in other cases, an international standard that another country or region adopts may be identical to standards recognized by FDA, such as ISO or IEC standards adopted as European standards, or EA and ISO, German standards, or British standards. However, we will not ordinarily recognize the identical international standards separately. These standards may be used as described in the FDA Guidance document, appropriate use of voluntary consensus standards in pre-market submissions for medical devices, and a sponsor should discuss with FDA its plans to use a national standard of another country, along with any other standards issues. FDA does not ordinarily consider normative references, that is, standards referenced within an FDA-recognized consensus standard, for separate recognition. This is because normative references do not typically refer to an entire standard. Rather, normative references typically refer to a specific clause or clauses. The citation of the normative reference within the FDA-recognized consensus standard will provide information about the extent to which the normative reference applies. In limited circumstances, FDA-recognized consensus standards are referenced within other standards recognized by FDA. In these circumstances, manufacturers and others might wish to refer to more recent versions of the normative references than have been recognized by FDA. More recent versions of the normative reference may address emerging issues of safety or technology before the currently recognized standard is updated to incorporate more recent normative references. For example, the 60601 family of standards includes multiple collaterals describing general testing for basic safety and essential performance, and many particulars describing specific test methods by product type and application. A particular typically includes reference to a collateral, and a collateral is typically updated prior to the particulars that reference it. In the circumstance in which a manufacturer is using a particular that references a collateral and both standards are recognized by FDA, a manufacturer may wish to refer to the most recent version of the collateral that has been recognized by FDA. Hopefully you followed all that. You will likely need knowledge of the normative references or reference documents to appropriately apply that standard. And then in terms of recognition, FDA recognizes standards by publication of a recognition list in the Federal Register. FDA will publish the recognition list at least annually. A list of consensus standards that FDA has recognized or decided to recognize is available on the FDA Recognized Consensus Standards Database website. Such standards are those that FDA has recognized by notice published in the Federal Register, or that FDA has decided to recognize but for which recognition is pending because a periodic notice has not yet appeared in the Federal Register. The database will provide the most up-to-date list of suitable standards because, after FDA has decided to recognize a standard, we will update our online database to reflect the decision even before recognition of the standard. The database will include a recognition number and a supplementary information sheet, or SIS, for each decision, including for cases for which recognition is pending. In terms of requesting recognition, any interested party may request recognition of a standard. A request for recognition of a standard should, at a minimum, contain the following information: name and electronic or mailing address of the requester, title of the standard, any reference number and date, proposed list of the product types, basis for recognition, and a brief identification of the testing or performance or other characteristics of the products or processes that would be addressed. Additional advice on procedures for requesting standards for recognition may be found at a link that's provided here in this guidance, and requests may be submitted by mail in writing to the Standards and Conformity Assessment Program, or SCAP, at the email address provided here as well, or at the address provided below. And in general, FDA will not automatically request copies of the standards submitted for recognition. However, there may be certain standards to which the agency does not have access, such as country-specific standards. Therefore, we recommend contacting SCAP at the email address provided prior to submitting a standards recognition request to determine whether the agency has access to the standard. When the agency receives a request for recognition of a standard, we intend to mail or email an acknowledgement letter to the contact person identified in the request. The acknowledgement letter will identify the date of receipt. This is the date that FDA received the request, the title of the standard, and a contact person at FDA who is assigned to oversee the recognition request. And then in extent of recognition, complete or partial recognition, FDA may recognize or decide to recognize all or part of a standard. The extent of recognition, EOR, is FDA's determination regarding which parts of a standard are appropriate for recognition. Within this context, recognize is a specific term derived from Section 514C of the FD&C Act, referring to the process for FDA identification of standards, which demonstrates scientific and technical merit that manufacturers of medical products may cite to meet relevant requirements of the FD&C Act and implement regulations. The EOR section of the SIS specifies the extent to which a standard is recognized. See Section V for more information about the supplementary information. SCAP is responsible for reviewing and recommending the supplementary information that accompanies each standard that is recognized. SCAP staff may contact the submitter for additional clarification regarding the request for recognition. Complete recognition here for a standard that can be recognized in its entirety. The EOR will state complete standard followed by the basis for that determination. FDA may have more than one reason for its determination. And for partial recognition for a standard that can be recognized in part, the EOR will state partial recognition followed with text that lists the parts of the standard that are not recognized. The titles and numbers of non-recognized sections or clauses of the standards will be listed sequentially as they appear in the standard, stating that they are not recognized. FDA will provide its rationale, basis for that determination, for the parts of the standards that are and are not recognized. And then for non-recognition of a standard, while it does not preclude the appropriate use of a standard under general use, this means that the standard generally does not satisfy or would not be helpful in satisfying a portion of the statute or regulations. FDA's rationale for this decision will be communicated to the submitter of the request, and this decision will be listed on the non-recognized standards database. FDA will explain the technical, scientific, regulatory, and/or other basis for the decision. If the standard contains specifications or methods that are not scientifically acceptable, not technically feasible, or conflict with existing FDA-recognized consensus standards, existing published policies, regulation, or the statute, FDA generally would not recognize the standard. FDA may also decide not to recognize a standard that creates a barrier to domestic or international trade or that impedes innovation or technical progress. If FDA decides not to recognize a standard, it would not receive a recognition number. And in terms of notification of determination, the statute directs FDA to make a determination on recognition, complete or partial, or non-recognition no later than 60 calendar days from the date the request was received. When such a determination is made, the agency will issue the determination letter to the submitter by mail using the mailing address provided or electronically using the email address provided. We will officially recognize the standard completely or partially by subsequent publication in the Federal Register. Note that the determination and corresponding update to our database may precede recognition via publication of the standard in the Federal Register through updates to the FDA-recognized consensus standards database for medical devices. In terms of supplementary information, the recognition of a standard typically includes a SIS for each standard recognized. This document, developed by FDA, is intended to assist manufacturers and product developers should they elect to use standards in their development, manufacturing, or for other purposes. The SIS includes the standard scope and other helpful information. The SIS for most vertical standards, that is product-specific standards, includes a list of relevant regulations and product codes for which the standard may be applicable. Although the agency makes every effort to keep the list in the SIS current, note that new product codes are continually being created, and as such, the list may not always be up to date. The list of product codes is intended to provide examples of products for which the standard may be applicable and is not intended to be exhausted. Product codes and regulations are typically not provided for horizontal standards, that is, biocompatibility or sterility standards, because maintaining a representative list would be impractical given the number of products impacted. In terms of essential information provided, the SIS typically includes essential information such as the recognition number and FDA Specialty Task Group, or STG. Other information may include the standard's designation number, date of publication, title, scope, US, parallel adoption, if any, extent of recognition, complete or partial, rationale for recognition, date of recognition, and transition periods, if any. In terms of scope, FDA intends to include the standard's scope in the SIS to assist manufacturers and FDA staff in determining whether the standard may be useful to them. Where a standard scope is extensive, the main body of the scope will be included with reference to the website where the entire scope can be located. In terms of FDA decision-making rationale, recognition of a voluntary consensus standard, either in whole or in part, can help facilitate meeting a requirement under the FDA Act or implementing regulations. For example, the standard may satisfy requirements regarding performance specifications, labeling, informed consent, or post-market activity. A standard may be relevant for a specific device, group of like devices, or a broad range of devices and medical products. A standard may also satisfy requirements related to quality system regulations, risk management, or good laboratory practices, as examples. FDA will provide its rationale for recognition of the standard in the SIS, including the scientific, technical, regulatory, or other basis as applicable. For the regulatory basis, FDA intends to provide supporting information illustrating the standard's regulatory applicability. For example, how the standards is or are relevant to FDA regulatory processes, guidance, and/or supporting publications. In terms of withdrawal of recognition, FDA may withdraw recognition of a previously recognized standard if the agency determines that the standard is no longer appropriate to support a DOC for meeting a requirement regarding devices under the FDA Act. The two primary situations where FDA may make this determination are described below. The first is if the FDA recognized consensus standard is replaced by a new version. When an SDO issues a new version or a revision that supersedes a standard recognized by FDA, FDA reviews the changes and decides whether to recognize the new version. If the new version is recognized, we will announce the change and usually withdrawal of the older version in a notice published in the Federal Register. We will add the new version to the recognized consensus standards database, and we will remove the older version from the database. FDA may provide a transition period during which both the old and new versions of a standard are recognized. And the transition period, if any, will be included in the SIS. Note that a transition period is only applicable to standards whose recognition is being withdrawn. When determining the timing of a transition period, FDA considers the public health impact of delaying implementation of significant scientific updates and the difficulty manufacturers may face while implementing the specific changes in the new version compared to the older version. For example, a standard with only minor technical or editorial changes may have a shorter transition period than a standard with changes that may take longer to implement. When a change to the standard impacts an emergent public health issue, FDA may assign a shortened or no transition period to respond to the issue with appropriate timeliness. For additional discussion regarding transition periods, please see FDA Guidance document Appropriate Use of Voluntary Consensus Standards in Pre-Market Submissions for Medical Devices. Standards may be revised after marketing authorization is granted, as discussed in Section 8 of the FDA Guidance document Appropriate Use of Voluntary Consensus Standards in Pre-Market Submissions for Medical Devices. Changes in recognized consensus standard do not retroactively affect a product's clearance or approval status. FDA recognized consensus standard is no longer appropriate for meeting a requirement is the second condition where FDA may withdraw recognition of standard, and it would do this if it determined that the standard is no longer appropriate for meeting a requirement regarding devices. In such an instance, a notice would be published in the Federal Register withdrawing FDA recognition. Use of non-recognized standards are discussed in the FDA Guidance document referenced here. And then FDA includes a little note about the Paperwork Reduction Act of 1995. And that's the end of the guidance document. I just want to, first of all, thank you very much for sticking with me to the end of the review here today. And just want to make sure that before you go, that you've managed to take with you a couple key points. And these are, one, understand FDA's recognition of standards basics, that's requests, extent of recognition or non-recognition. Two, essential information provided, the scope, and FDA decision-making rationale. And three, the conditions for withdrawal of recognition when there's a new version published or when a standard is no longer appropriate to meet the requirements. Again, thank you very much for joining me today. I do hope that you found today's video helpful. Please like and subscribe. Give me comments and feedback. Very open to suggestions for new videos as well. So look forward to your comments and look forward to catching you in the next video. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day. Bye.